Greetings from the Philippines. I'm Bernie Villegas, a professor of economics at the University of Asia and the Pacific, a corporate undertaking of the Prelature of Opus Dei. In addition to teaching economics to undergraduates and graduate students, I'm very much involved in what is known as economic forecasting, helping mostly people in business, but also government officials, leaders of non-governmental organizations, to fathom the economic future. As we all know, when people make plans for the future, like for example, in the very necessary task of budgeting, they have to assume what is going to happen. Right? Rather, for example, the next 12 months, short-term forecasting, or the next 3 to 5 years. And that's where I come in. And in this task that I've been performing for over 50 years, I have gotten the nickname of Prophet of Boom. Because, referring to the theme of this conference, Sharing Joy, I always try to share my inherent optimism with the people I help in looking into the future. Just to use a metaphor, I'm used to seeing the glass as half filled, even if it is also half empty. And therefore, I always focus on what we can call the strengths and opportunities faced by leaders and executives in the economic environment, instead of obsessing with the threats and weaknesses. And modesty aside, I have always been proven right that after a difficult economic situation, there is always a recovery. I still remember the look of disbelief in the face of the former President Corazon Aquino when, after the so-called EDSA revolution, some people asked me to give her an economic briefing. At that time, in 1986, the Philippine economy was in a very sorry state. We had huge debts we could not pay. The gross domestic product was declining as much as 8%. Inflation was at 50%. Things were really very bad. But I told Cory, don't worry, Madam President. Soon you will see a recovery. And true enough, starting 1988, and for the next 8 to 10 years, the gross domestic product of the Philippines started to grow at 4 to 5%, which at that time was a reasonable rate. I focused on the resilience of Filipinos and the strength of the private sector and some of the very competent professionals who were appointed in very important positions of the economy. And that's why, focusing on the strengths and opportunities, I was able to reassure the President that after that depression, there would be a recovery. And true enough, all the way up to 1997, some of you in business will remember, there was the East Asian financial crisis, where our neighbors like Thailand, Indonesia, Korea were declining at 8, 12%. Our decline was limited to less than 1%. And then later on, during the so-called Great Depression, during 2008, that resulted from the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Again, all over the world, economies were tanking. Actually, in 2009, we even had a positive growth rate of 1%. So, history is on my side as regards optimism. But I'd like to say that beyond the human reasons for optimism, because I'm trying to live the spirituality of Opus Dei, whose very foundation, as Saint Josemaria said, is the awareness of divine filiation, that we are children of God. And you know that God is such an infinitely good Father that He will never allow anything that happens to us to hurt us. And since everything that happens to us is either willed or permitted by God our Father, then we can be sure, also using a phrase of Saint Josemaria, omnia in bonum, really citing from the Bible that everything works unto good to those who love God. And that is really even a much stronger foundation from optimism than all the tools of economic forecasting. But some people may object, saying, oh, but isn't this world a valley of tears? As we say in that prayer to Our Lady, Hail Holy Queen. Yes, but that's only part of the truth. Yes, we have to grow, to suffer, to experience tribulations, trials, contradictions. Because if we really want to be a Christian, we have to do what Christ told us. If you want to follow me, take up your cross. And we have to take up our cross. And so there is some truth to this phrase. We have to go through this life as a valley of tears. And some of these sufferings we take upon ourselves voluntarily as sacrifice and mortification. But let me point out that in the Old Testament, we also read that this world is a valley of lilies. You know, I have been gardening since I can remember from my youth. And I like talks about gardens, roses, orchids, lilies. And if you read the beautiful verses of the Song of Solomon, for example, chapter 6, verse 2. My beloved has gone down to his garden, to the beds of spice, to graze on the garden, and to gather lilies. Obviously, the reference to the beloved is to God, to Christ. Another verse. My beloved is mine, and I am his. He grazes among the lilies. So that's the other side of the coin. That His world is a garden of lilies which we should enjoy. God wants us to start our heaven on earth. In fact, I dare to say that if we don't find heaven on earth, we will not find heaven in the life hereafter. And that is why we can always share the joy that we have if we are truly Christ-centered, especially among the people closest to us. Members of our family, I always also recall the phrase used by Saint Josemaria about the obligation of parents and members of a family, that they have to contribute to building a bright and cheerful home. Not by doing anything extraordinary, but very small acts of services that brighten the lives of those who are close to us, including, of course, our intimate friends. We have to radiate joy. And among other small things that Saint Josemaria always advised is, we must always have a smile on our face. There are enough difficulties encountered by people that we cannot worsen the situation by having a gloomy face going around. So everyone can try to share joy by always trying to smile. And so, just to end, let me use another metaphor. We have to always be optimistic so that when we go through what is known as a dark tunnel, whether it is like today, all the sufferings because of the pandemic, people close to us dying, people getting sick, and not to mention the tremendous drop in income and employment, we must always share this optimism, both based on human science and most importantly, on our being Christ-centered. And we should always remind people close to us that there is a light at the end of any dark tunnel. And we know very well what that light is. It's the Lumen Christi, the light that Christ brought to this world when He came to redeem sinful humanity. So I'd like to greet all of you Merry Christmas, and I just was reminded of another flower. Just as a practical tip, do what I did recently. Very early in November, I went to the store selling flowers. I got a pair of poinsettias and placed them in strategic locations in my home, because the sight of that very brilliant Christmas flower will automatically bring cheer to members of your family. So, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.